This is Thinking in Public, a program dedicated to intelligent conversation about frontline theological and cultural issues with the people who are shaping them. I'm Albert Mohler, your host and president of the Southern Baptist Theological Seminary in Louisville, Kentucky. Dr. James Lindsay is a public intellectual, a notable author on a range of subjects. He holds a doctorate in mathematics from the University of Tennessee at Knoxville, but his academic and intellectual output expand well beyond the fields of physics and math. His 6 books span a variety of fields, from philosophy and science to religion and contemporary thought. He's also the co-founder of New Discourses. His most recent book, Cynical Theories, How Activist Scholarship Made Everything About Race, Gender, and Identity, and Why This Harms Everybody, he co-wrote with Helen Pluckrose. It's an important critique of critical theory and contemporary culture. It's a tour de force looking at the intellectual landscape that we confront today. I'm looking forward to this conversation with James Lindsay. Dr. James Lindsay, welcome to Thinking in Public.
Yeah, thanks for having me. I'm excited to be here.
Yeah, the title of your new book is Cynical Theories, with the word critical crossed out. The subtitle, How Activist Scholarship Made Everything About Race, Gender, and Identity, and Why This Harms Everybody. You wrote the book with Helen Pluckrose, and it's making quite a splash, not only perhaps in academic circles, but also in a larger reach. And my guess is that was a part of the intention behind your writing of the book.
Yeah, the goal of writing the book was actually to try to get these ideas outside of the academy. It's nice if we can get the academy to reckon with the argument that we've made, but it's more important from our perspective for average people to understand this very academic language and to understand where these ideas have come from.
Yeah, because as we'll get to in your argument, the problem is that what happens on the campus doesn't stay on the campus, and that's something we're witnessing right now in many ways on the streets of America.
That's right. That's right. It's a lot of people believe that the university is just this removed place where kind of peculiar professors go and they teach their ideas, their theories, and then young people go and they have their college experience, whatever that all entails, some of which is academic and a lot of which is probably growing up for the first time away from home. And that it doesn't really matter much what happens in the university, but this is not true. Ideas have consequences, and ideas are concentrated and they're explored and they're developed, and then they're taught within the context of the university, and they're taught to people who will go on to be our professionals. They're taught to people who go on to be our teachers and so on. So ideas definitely do not stay in the university.
Now, I want to come back to that a bit later because I want to engage you in an argument about why certain ideas follow certain trajectories from the campus into popular culture. But holding that back for a moment, we've got our own meta-narrative to deal with here. Your book is not only a book about ideas and analysis. It's also, I think, kind of cleverly constructed around a narrative. There's a timeline to this as well, and you have to kind of work through the book to get that timeline. But that timeline has a great deal to do with my life. I'm age 60, and I arrived at the university campus just about the time a lot of this hit on the shores of the United States. And I was in a particular place where I got it kind of full bore when I was 17, 18, 19 years old, trying to figure some of these things out. And, the language came about postmodernism. And that was really interesting to me because as a teenager, trying to deal with intellectual ideas and very interested in philosophy and theology, apologetics, just trying to figure this out, it was clear that modernity was not what the founders of the modern age had intended, and that was the end of kind of like Francis Fukuyama, the end of history in their own sense. They thought they had arrived at this kind of permanent moment in the aftermath of the Enlightenment. Clearly, by the 1960s, things were unraveling. That was not it. And they'd unraveled more quickly, probably due to the crucible of war, for one thing, in Europe. But Europe had landed in the United States in a big way. But to make the meta-narrative kind of come a little bit further, by the time I was doing graduate work, the entire academy was in a postmodern moment. Not every academic, but the academic mood. But then came the declaration about 99, 2005, postmodernism's over. But I think one of the best arguments you make in your book is that postmodernism is not over, it was never over.
That's right. In fact, I think we where we had the postmodern philosophers, particularly Jean-Francois Lyotard, saying that we live in the postmodern condition, and he wrote that in 1979, I think we now actually live in the postmodern condition. And I think the internet has a lot to do with that. The internet is sort of postmodernity's playground, if you will. And so the argument or the arc of the book is to actually disabuse academics of the belief that postmodernism died and convince them that what happened is that it mutated or it changed. Yeah. It became something different in that, we kind of earmarked the 3-year span between 1989 and 1991 for when that transformation really took place.
Yeah. Just looking at this in the timeline, the problem with postmodernism all along was asking what comes after postmodernism. But in every one of these big intellectual movements, there's been no retreat to a status quo ante. So in other words, postmodernism didn't mean that modernism ended. It was, I think, Habermas and others, speaking of a hypermodernity. So this is, of course, Habermas didn't like it in a lot of ways, but it was an unfolding of the next stage. It was no retreat to a pre-modern condition. That was unthinkable in the academy. And then with postmodernism, even when it was declared to be over, it was kind of over because it won. A lot of the discourse, a lot of the intellectual environment of the American Academy, it didn't return to, Enlightenment rationality. It dived deeper into politics.
I mean, that's generally the trajectory. That's right. You mentioned Habermas. You could bring up Zygmunt Bauman and his liquid modernity as the next evolution, and he kind of makes the argument that the rationalist project slowly dissolved all of the foundations of society into everything that had solidity became liquid, and that what people call postmodernism is kind of an extreme variation on that, and he rejects the idea of postmodernism and says that this is just very late stage modernism. My argument would be, kind of to answer much of what you just said, that the people, and maybe even the people who are the architects of liberalism in the first place, which is the philosophical foundation that gave rise to modernity, maybe didn't understand exactly what they were creating. And I don't think most people who support the free and advanced societies that we live in now fully understand that liberalism was always meant to be, whether the architects of it meant that or not, it functions. So functionally, it's always been a means of resolving conflicts between people who disagree. In the political realm, we solve those with democracy. In the economic realm, we solve those with the market. And with knowledge, we resolve those with rational discussion, rational debate, the ability to try to get away from our biases or to minimize their influence, to check one idea against another. So you and I may disagree on many things, and I'm sure we do. We can do so in certain ways that are pro-social and productive, or we could do so in ways that are less good, antisocial or destructive. And as a means of conflict resolution, liberalism allows you to forward your idea, me to forward my idea, you check my ideas, I check yours. And ideally, we would be carving away wheat from chaff by that process. And so my thinking at this point is that the postmodernists in particular, but also the critical theorists who were working alongside them in some respects, historically speaking, not directly, misunderstood liberalism. And now that we find ourselves in a very postmodern condition, most people seem to misunderstand what liberalism is. And again, just to be very clear, because we're Americans, we don't mean Democrats or anything like that. We mean the philosophical underpinnings of the Declaration of Independence, the Constitution,
classical liberalism,
even the Magna Carta, Thomas Paine, all of these, John Locke, and so on. Even the Reformation, as a matter of fact.
Yeah. Lots to talk about here. But as we're thinking about postmodernism and having this conversation, we need to define the terms, just in general terms. Rejection of the meta-narrative, you mentioned Lyotard. And that's the idea. There's no all-encompassing narrative to which all human beings are ultimately accountable, and it gives the world meaning. And so that would mean, in one sense, the eclipse of Marxism and Christianity, the meta-narratives of the West in particular. But that gets me to another point that I kind of intuited as a teenager trying to look at this, and it's been demonstrated again and again to me as I look at the history of thought in the West. After the Enlightenment, people put these, in the Enlightenment itself, they put these extraordinary hopes for human liberation in some new way of thinking, but that liberation never comes. And so one of the things, you look at Derek Bell, and so he's extremely critical of the civil rights movement because it didn't bring about the liberation that he thought would come. The philosophers of the Enlightenment, well, their grandchildren thought the Enlightenment didn't deliver. And so, postmodernism said, all the meta-narratives of the modern age didn't deliver. And now you've got what you call reified postmodernism, in which case you've got the grandchildren of the postmodernists saying postmodernism didn't deliver. There's a lot of frustration here.
That's right. And that's in fact why we called the book Cynical Theories. Our understanding of what you've just described is that the theorists who, especially the postmodernists, who were very frustrated. To characterize the postmodernists very briefly as a set of people who were working in a particular time and place, they were Marxists who saw Marxism failing. So they couldn't believe in liberalism, they couldn't believe in Christianity, they couldn't believe in capitalism. And now the thing they did believe in had also failed them. So they were very, very pessimistic. But what we constantly see with this rejection of meta-narratives and so on is this tendency to look at these ideals like they're going to, like there's a faith that they are supposed to deliver everything perfectly. And it's very easy to become cynical when reality slaps you upside the head and says things aren't that simple. My co-author Helen is very eloquent at saying that the postmodernists would have had a more reasonable case if it were true that the moment liberalism arrived on the scene, then everything was supposed to be liberal. Right. But that's, of course, that's absurd. And there's a very strong feeling that that's almost how they think about the world. Oh, so now, we have the Civil Rights Act, so racism is supposed to just go away. That's not realistic. The question and the reason, and we saw this particularly in Foucault's genealogies, but you can see it in the 1619 Project today. You can see it in essentially any of the analysis that we talk about. There's this assumption. Also, I should bring up the idea of positivism with science, that there's this belief that science is very scientific era in the 1940s and 50s. You can even think of those television and radio programs where they have that voice, the 1950s voice. I even say that, and you know what I'm talking about. We have science. Absolutely. And we are going to go to the moon. It's got this very self-certain thing. And if we had the expectation that now meant that all the problems were going to be solved, and maybe the tones of voice and the attitudes of the spokespeople gave that impression, then there would be something more reasonable in postmodernism. But this is mostly a cynical read of one step from another. You can take, say, Michel Foucault's History of Sexuality, and he says, well, Christianity got it wrong. Then we moved into sexology, and that got it wrong. And then we moved into this kind of criminal thinking about it, and that got it wrong. And so we're always going to have it wrong. But at no point do you ever see this, well, we're still not perfect, but we got it better. You never have that kind of an admission, which I think is core to the liberal project, which is why they always say that it's supposed to be radicals or whatever, revolutionaries up against the status quo. But in liberalism, if you understand what it does, there is no status quo. There's always a perpetual state of learning, and using that learning to reflect on society and hopefully do better by it. Yeah,
the postmodernists, and here I'm talking about the ones who were self-consciously a part of postmodernism, especially in the 70s and 80s. They were filled with enormous frustration, and I think a part of that is because you had the failure of Marxism as a communist revolution on the part of the proletariat over economic issues. It didn't happen in Western Europe. But, I was just reading the other day Rosa Luxemburg and reminding myself that frustration came really early. It's so early that Lenin had to deal with it. Why was there no revolution in the most industrialized city on the planet, which was London at the time. And in particular, why was there no Marxist revolution in Germany? Because it would have made philosophical sense that it would have happened there. And so you have this enormous frustration with communism not working. And then I want to fast forward just for the sake of clarity and time here. I arrived on a college campus in 1977, and it was a secular university. I spent a year as a faculty scholar at a university in Florida. And Florida was doing a pretty clever thing back then, they thought. You still had mandatory retirement for academics in 1977. And so the state of Florida basically sent teams up to places like Harvard, Yale, Brown, and went to professors about age 65 and said, hey, why don't you come work in Florida? Join this new university faculty, and you can basically end up retiring in Florida. We'll pay the bills. And so I got all these professors from the Ivy League in particular and other places who ended up in this university. And it was the first time I heard this, James. They were saying, look, here's the deal. It is clear that the consumer suburban society of the rationalized West is never going to allow for or facilitate the rising up of the proletariat in a Marxist revolution as in classical Marxism. But that's okay, because there's another way for this to happen. It won't be from the bottom up like the proletariat. It's going to be from the top down through the institutions. And so I'd not heard the name of Gramsci at that point, but it was basically Rudi Dutschke and the long march through the institutions. And so they were saying, look, what we're going to do is take Marxist analysis and run it through all the disciplines in the academy and then through all the institutions. But I think they thought that was going to bring an immediate revolution in society. I think if my professors in 1977 saw America in 2020, they'd be very frustrated. Isn't there just that kind of frustration that every generation thinks they're going to deliver on this?
I think that's probably right. I mean, ever since especially the failures in the 1920s and 30s that you were speaking of, there's been kind of a repeating cycle where various academics who, to put it flatly, are a very bourgeois class of people, have decided that they're going to figure out the right way. They kind of appoint themselves like philosopher kings, and they're going to figure out the right way to teach everybody to think. They're going to give them a critical consciousness, and that will change everything. And so there's these kind of cycles of very bourgeois theories that don't really connect to reality, because even with Marx, which was, not, well, maybe you could say it's bourgeois or not, there's still there's this analysis which points at some truths and some things that are incorrect. And then there's this kind of like gray area where nobody knows how it works. And then all of a sudden we have the communist utopia. And nobody's ever solved for the how it works part. Meanwhile, of course, academics that are opposed to this have figured out why there will be no making it work. So it is a self-frustrating philosophy. And because again, the cynicism, because it then focuses on its own failures and blames the system for those failures. It can't say it's our own shortcomings that prevent us from getting to where we want to go. It has to be the nefarious powers. It has to be the false consciousness. It has to be the ruling classes. It has to be these people instilling ideologies in all of us. They are unable to understand that the source of their own frustration is themselves, and then they're able to project that outward. And so the frustration mounts, and it kind of goes in these cycles where then eventually it bursts out onto the scene, as we're seeing in 2020, as we saw in 1968. I think that this is a pretty cogent analysis of the genus of the problem, as opposed to just the species that we're dealing with at present.
But one might argue in retrospect that the most surprising aspect of all of this is that critical theory itself would emerge as a conversation, rather necessary conversation in the United States, and necessitate your book. Because critical theory, as it began, we'll talk about the Frankfurt School and all those figures, it didn't get so far politically, even in Germany, for instance. But now all of a sudden it's been revivified, and now it shows up as this explosive intellectual solvent working its way through the academy. How did that happen?
So the thing is that critical theory started off, I would even argue, I don't agree with it, but it started off responsibly. You had Horkheimer laying out this concept that traditional theories, meaning rationality, philosophy, empiricism, science, are not necessarily sufficient to deal with the moral implications of ideas that come out of that line of inquiry. And so you need this second dimension to analysis, this critical theory. And in particular, we want to be as charitable and generous to their case as possible. They literally were staring at fascism and saying something is causing fascism, something is causing genocides, mass scale, the Holocaust, and so on. And it is the rejection of any sense of morality, the understanding that with science and technology, maybe we can do this. So the question of should is utterly removed. And this leads to true horrors. But their original formulation, and you can even find Herbert Marcuse in the 1970s complaining about this in a very famous interview he did on television. They believe that it should be done in a very intellectual way, that critical theory and traditional theory should be combined. Now, I don't want to rescue critical theory or even any of these particular critical theorists from the consequences of their ideas, but the truth is that they at least tried to be more responsible with it. Now, I mentioned Herbert Marcuse, and Herbert Marcuse is kind of a transformational figure, and the United States becomes a transformational context. Why didn't it take off in Germany? Well, I can't say for sure, but I can guess at why it was successful taking off in the United States. There was a very virulent strain of leftist activism that arose around the civil rights movement. And if you read One Dimensional Man, Herbert Marcuse is very clear that racial minorities are an avenue to tap for this conflict theory-based oppressor versus oppressed resentment to try to wake up and achieve liberation. So now you have this move from let's look at the production of culture, mass culture, elite culture, high culture, middle culture, stealing away the revolutionary will, popular culture, very Adorno at that point, saying things like that. And now it's shifted to let's get the others. Let's gather the others. Let's gather in particular the racial minorities, and let's combine them. This is explicitly a quote from One Dimensional Man. Let's combine them with the radical intelligentsia in the university. And so now you have this very willful move to make it about identity politics, which obviously in the 1960s were extremely relevant in the United States, but they've never lost their relevance. Then what happened was that they started to become less and less important as the echoes of the civil rights era and civil rights legislation came down through history, so that by the 1980s and going into the 1990s, they were seriously having diminishing returns. So that's where you start to have the analyses of Derek Bell, critical race theorist number one, along with Kimberly Crenshaw, critical race theorist number two. I mean, literally, they're named as the two founders, mentor and mentee at Harvard Law, laying out this new vision that clearly somehow the oppressor-oppressed dynamic has never been resolved, that this wasn't a success. It didn't bring total racial reconciliation or total racial equality. So something is missing. And they devised critical race theory, for example. And the race issue is an extremely touchy one, but we could, of course, talk about the way that the feminists used it for that issue. We could talk about the way that the LGBT, I think it was just the Gay Lesbian Alliance at the time, used it in terms of the gay, what became the gay pride movement. And so you can start looking at all the different identity factors. We could even get into the aspects of the social model of disability. Eventually, fat activism arose out of fat feminism, and you get all of the various pieces of the puzzle kind of coming to fore, where it became about identity politics. And I think the vector there was that Herbert Marcuse intentionally made it about identity politics. And then he trained a generation of radicals, including most obviously and openly Angela Davis, the black feminist, who then went to Palestine and further radicalized herself, and then came back with this whole new way of thinking that sort of founded the black feminism movement in that liberationist paradigm. And so that really set the stage for how critical theory retained its relevance. And so Helen and I have a discussion that we've decided doesn't matter. At that crucial point at the end of the 1980s and into the 1990s, was it that postmodernism mutated into a critical theory that uses postmodern tools, or was it that critical theory picked up postmodern weapons? Which one is the main object? And what we finally decided over months and months and months and months of discussion about this back and forth, she said it is postmodernism picking up critical theory. I said it's critical theory that has learned to be postmodern. we decided they fused. They just
Yeah.
fused. They cherry picked, these activists in the 90s cherry picked from both traditions, very anti-intellectually,
But it's
using
very easy to
postmodernism to
do.
justify that. And here we are.
Yeah, it's very easy to do because they're amazingly parallel in their hopes and aspirations, and they're amazingly similar in the fact that everything has to fit into a oppression oppressor kind of matrix. And by the way, Marcuse comes to the United States. He arguably had his greatest influence in the United States, and so the hotbed of a lot of this shifted from Frankfurt to Berkeley. And right here in the United States, Americans largely unaware of all of this. You point to the trajectory of, so let's assume these movements have fused, but now it's being driven through every single discipline. So and in chapter by chapter, you really very helpfully lay out. And I think again, it's somewhat sequential with post-colonial theory and then queer theory and critical race theory, intersectionality, feminism and gender theory, and then disability and fat studies. And look, a lot of Americans are going to be shocked by that last part because, as you say, it's actually more au courant at the current moment in England, in Britain. But nonetheless, this is the world we live in now. And what is shocking to me as a theologian and cultural analyst is that that this is showing up explicitly now. That's what's different. All these ideas were behind what was coming out of Hollywood, where Marcuse, by the way, had enormous influence. It was always a subtext. It was only in the background. But now it's being foregrounded in ways that I think are actually shocking. So walk us through the chapters.
Okay, yeah. So the book is organized to explain what postmodernism is, to derive its core principles and themes so it's identifiable, so that we can track it through history. And then it moves into describing what we call applied postmodernism, which is where the critical theory infused itself into postmodernism or vice versa. And it became packaged up for activists. And the way that happened was that they chose, for various reasons that I think I described well enough already, to use identity and systemic oppression based on identity as an objectively real thing that is obviously only subjectively experienced and only can be communicated in terms of subjective terms. So that applied postmodernism continues those themes and those various principles of postmodernism, but now has them in a very activist-oriented way, where it's no longer the goal to deconstruct everything, because it's believed that you can't deconstruct a system of oppression without having. You can't deconstruct the lived reality of systemic oppression without having the privilege of being outside of it. So this was the observation that changed the course. It came from the Black feminists in particular. And then it goes into these various theories. So post-colonial theory, fell mostly from Edward Said, who combined Frantz Fanon, the very, very radical, psychoanalyst who analyzed the post-colonial context, the wretched of the earth, black skins, white masks. You could even say that Antifa is the combination of Herbert Marcuse and Frantz Fanon's philosophy. And you can get that by reading their books, where they cite them all the time and say that that's the case. So post-colonial theory wanted to explore this oppressor-oppressed dynamic in terms of the East versus the West, or the West as setting up its own goodness and power over Eastern cultures as being barbaric and backwards and superstitious, whereas the West is enlightened and rational and scientific and civilized. And it used a very both Foucauldian and Derridian analysis to try to flip that around. Edward Said's book was called Orientalism, and he said that this construction is Orientalism, which was a very rhetorically and politically savvy move, because the people who studied outside of the Western context called themselves Orientalists in a very neutral way before that. So he therefore rendered all of his critics branded. The
United States State Department had an entire department basically known as the Orientalists. I mean,
exactly. So he very savvy move. And then the goal there then is to deconstruct the colonial mindset. And then once you start to say that things like, using the postmodern aspect of this, that thought, knowledge systems, language, those are actually products of the Western culture, and science is usually one of them that's named as a product of the Western culture, that anybody who takes those things up has now been colonized by the West, and so they have to be decolonized. So you're allowed to now use post-colonial theory to take apart literally anything that resembles rational or scientific thought. With queer theory, the object, this is mostly going to be Judith Butler. We could name other characters as well, of course, but the object became to take apart stable categories of sex, gender, and sexuality in order to liberate people from the violence of categorization, as it's called, that they happen to be who they are. And that's an intolerable thing. And so queer theory was born out of a desire to examine the ideas of normal and abnormal, and to remove or even reverse the ideas of whether normal and abnormal are good or not. Critical race theory came out of critical legal studies. We mentioned that a moment ago with Derek Bell and Kimberly Crenshaw. It took on postmodern tools, and it took on a very explicitly identity-first approach. Kimberly Crenshaw, very famously in Mapping the Margins, this is her 1991 paper, where she says that intersectionality, she doesn't introduce intersectionality here, but she defines it the most clearly. She laid it out a few years earlier in another paper. But in this paper, she says that intersectionality is a provisional concept that's used to link contemporary politics to postmodern theory. And what she means by contemporary politics, she says at the beginning of the paper, is the liberationist, radical, in other words, neo-Marxist critical theory paradigm. And she says that we're now going to recognize that a statement, I am black, is more important and more valuable than a statement like I am a person who happens to be black, because the second of these forwards universal humanity first. And as you talked about with the pessimism here, the liberalism had failed. That approach had failed. Colorblindness had failed. So now we have to focus on race all the time in everything in order to try to remove the stain of racism, if you will. So it's like this, they have this idea like the fabric of society itself in every dimension is stained with racism. And the only way, this is an indelible stain. You read Derek Bell, he says it has a permanence to it. You read any of the core critical race theory texts, and they start off by saying that the racism is the ordinary state of affairs in society. You read Robin DiAngelo's distillation of this from 2013, and she says the question is no longer did racism take place, but how did racism manifest in the situation? For it's to be assumed that it's in every situation, and the analysis is to find it, which is again a very cynical way to read human interactions, phenomena, or organizations. And so this is a very kind of cynical way to approach the idea of race, but it's also a very divisive way that forwards the ideas that race has to be made relevant, more relevant, and more relevant, and more relevant in order to overcome the problem of racism, which they see as kind of a permanent stain on the fabric of society. And they see no way to remove this stain, so the fabric itself has to be unmade and remade in a critical fashion in order not to have it. So this is a pretty nasty way to approach this. Gender theory came along out of kind of feminism going into women's studies. It's kind of a very complicated history. Lots of branches of feminism. Turns out none of them get along. We started out the chapter by chronicling something. Poor Helen had chronicled something like 25 different branches of feminism. Yeah. And I said, Helen, we can't do 25. We have to do like 3. And this is way too many. We have to group them up somehow. Nobody's going to pay attention to this. But yeah, gender studies came out of women's studies by trying to say that the object of relevance is seeing gender as being socially constructed, and to advance that idea as far as humanly possible. Of course, queer theory spun out of this idea, so those are related. But the idea went so far as even within queer theories to say that sex is also socially constructed, everything's socially constructed. Right. And so the idea is to interrogate the social construction of gender and thus try to render it deconstructed and less meaningful. Fat and disability studies apply the same line of thinking, especially the identity first thinking we see in critical race theory got adopted into these many of the methods of queer theory got adopted. They see, being disabled as abnormal, being fat as abnormal as society views things, and therefore we have to do the normal, abnormal queer analysis. They're kind of these latecomers to the party, very hodgepodge sticking together of ideas that the other theories had already developed. The one that people will find most alarming, of course, is I've run into this. It surprises me. I've lost touch a little bit. People say, fat studies, what's that? Is that like studying, obesity? And it's the systematic rejection of the idea of obesity as a oppressive discourse generated by medicine to control fat people. It's a very conspiracy theory.
And that's a real
mentality.
argument. I came across this when I was in London just before COVID-19, and on university campuses. That's a much more vibrant, I'll say that, discussion there, where the norms of medicine are now being rejected as being a part of a capitalist, consumerist conspiracy.
Right. Yeah. That it goes so far as to even say that if we were to come up with, say that the pharmaceutical companies finally had found their, if you will, holy grail, pardon the metaphor, but if they found their pill that cures being overweight, that brings people to their ideal weight, that would actually be a fat genocide. They perceive it that way. And
that same argument is being, on this side of the Atlantic, used increasingly, and I confronted it pastorally in the last year by people who say if deafness could be cured or blindness could be cured,
right,
that would be the genocide of deaf people and blind people.
Right, which is alarming, but I'll give you an even more alarming one. Imagine that same pill I just mentioned with regard to fat actually existed, and it were to bring people to their ideal weight. There are actually communities called pro-ana, which refers to pro-anorexia, that see anorexia nervosa itself, a severe eating disorder that's extraordinarily dangerous and unhealthy, especially to young girls, as an identity to be leaned into, as an identity to embrace. So if a pill were to be invented that brought people to their ideal weight, which is a healthy weight, which is not an anorexic weight, you would then have that being a genocide of the anorexic identity.
Yeah. But that gets me to a huge question that you don't resolve really in your book, but it's in the background to everything. And that is that if you take the Western conception of humanity, and I'm going to say a biblical conception of humanity, there are three different contexts. It starts with every single human being made in the image of God, and situated within a particular context of family. And then you do have on the other side, you might say the largest category is humanity as what we share in common. Every single one of us made in God's image, regardless of race, creed, ethnicity, historical placement, et cetera. And in between is social man or social humanity. The critical theorists, and especially by the time you get to identity politics, everything's the group. The individual largely disappears. And
right.
And Western liberalism, and by that we mean the Western experiment in ordered liberty, as in the Declaration of Independence, is built upon an understanding of the importance of the individual and the concern the individual is going to be crushed by the society. But now, individual disappears into these group identities.
That's right. Yeah, the fourth of the four themes that we outline in Cynical Theories of Postmodernism is the denial of the universal of humanity, the denial of the individual in favor of group identity. In this school of thought, they call it positionality. That the individual is to be understood in terms of their, almost like an ambassador for their group identities, which are to be understood intersectionally. And so all of your relevant group identities, which mix and match, are relevant, and you have to recognize as an ambassador of those groups that you're not an individual, but rather you're a spokesperson. So you would have to say things like, say you were a black man, you would have to come out and say, well, as a man, I have to have to remain silent and listen to my female compatriots. And as a black person, I can say that this has been my lived experience of oppression. This gives me unique insight, which is the intersectional derivation of what the feminists earlier had come up with called standpoint epistemology or standpoint theory. So you have this issue now where you always have to speak as an identity, and it's because the notion that came from, I think it originated in feminism, personal is political, has gone
the slogan
a step further, where the is now kind of both directions. The person is their politics. So this is why, for example, you see someone like Kanye West put on "Make America Great Again" hat, and then the next thing you know, you have Ta-Nehisi Coates coming out and saying he's not really black.
Right.
So he's disqualified himself, and this, of course, was explained more explicitly later by our friend at the New York Times, Nicole Hannah-Jones, who did the 1619 Project, and she said, "Well, there's a difference between being racially black and being politically black." Which, if you want to play it clearly, what this tells you is that the ideology thinks only in terms of people that it agrees with, and that's the only people it speaks for. It doesn't speak for, say, black people or gay people or women. It speaks for socially constructed groups, and those people who speak authentically to the way the theory conceives of those are the ones who are the authentic representatives. Yeah. And that's what intersectionality demands of people.
Most readers realize that every time you read a book, you're effectively having a conversation with the author or authors. That's particularly true in a book like this. And now I have the opportunity for a conversation with one of the authors. And that's an incredible privilege. But reading is a privilege. Just the opportunity to pick up a book and engage with another's mind. That's a rare privilege. And to take ideas seriously and charitably, but always critically in the best sense, reading a book, reading a newspaper article, or anything, consuming any artifact of our consumer culture. It requires us to think carefully about what we're doing while we're reading, and to think about thinking as we're thinking. And that's the fun of it. So intellectually, critical theory is something like an acid. And it reminds me of a parable that Daniel Dennett at Tufts University has used, and that's the parable of the universal acid. And he talked about being a teenager and imagining an acid that would dissolve everything, including the container that held it, and including the table in which it sat, until eventually the entire cosmos is destroyed by this universal acid. And I think that parable plays out here because we see it in real time. I mean, the headlines this week are about Ellen DeGeneres on the wrong side of history.
Mm-hmm, that's right.
Because
this is exactly
you can't stay on the left. Yeah. Go ahead.
No, I'm sorry, I didn't even hear the last part because
I mean, you can't stay on the left. So Betty Friedan, the prophetess of second wave feminism, by 1977 she's threatened with being kicked out of the movement because she's anti-lesbian, and sees it as the lavender menace, and Martina Navratilova is now on the wrong side of history because she believes that women, biological women, ought to compete in women's sports at the highest level. You can't stay au courant on the left for long.
That's right. Yeah, this is not an ideology that can be compromised with. A lot of people want to try to introduce, a soft version of it or whatever. They think, oh, well, we can bring it in a little bit. We can use it analytically. But the centerpiece of the ideology is complicity with systems of oppression. That is the object at the very center. So I started off earlier saying ideas have consequences. That idea has a consequence, is that if anything that is complicit with systemic oppression is bad, it's only a matter of time until they figure out a way that you are also complicit with systemic oppression. So you can't compromise with this ideology. You can't bring a little bit of it in because if they compromise with you, if you try to have a compromise with them, and it's very important. Somebody asked me on Twitter just a little while ago, what treaty, what truce, what compromise could we make to just get this to stop? Which is the fear, because people will want the mayhem to stop. And the answer is there's not one, because if they said, okay, if you sat down with one of them, for example, and one of these very radical activists, maybe Angela Davis, I don't know, we'll just pick a name, and you said, this is as far as I'm willing to go, but I'm willing to bend on X, Y, and Z, but I'm not willing to bend on R, S, and Q. And she signed to that would mean that she's being complicit in the oppressions of R, S, and Q, which is exactly the opposite of what is possible within their ideology. So the only way that they can compromise, the only way that they can have anything short of total acceptance of their critical view, liberation from oppression being the key and only moral value, is by having all of the power, having all of the say. Anything else betrays their ideology. Anything else betrays their one core value. It would be like turning your back on God, which, as a Christian, you'll understand is not something that is something you can be compromising about. So there's no room for a compromised partial position. I mean, you will, I think, know about the fake papers we wrote a couple of years ago, the fake academic papers, and one of them
Oh yeah.
was a translation of a chapter of Hitler's Mein Kampf, and the phrase from that really stuck out to me was, "There will be no half measures," and that's how this works. There are no half measures. Meanwhile, because it can find oppression in anything. Remember, it's not. The question is not, did racism take place, but how did racism manifest in this situation? Because it can read into it any way that it wants, and it's anti-intellectual, and it's now postmodern, and that it's all about subjective truth and not objective reality. It can attach to anything. It can attach to Christian faith. It can attach to education. It can attach to national governments. It can attach to our nuclear labs, apparently. It can attach literally to anything and make a critical theory of anything, even math. I mean, there's been a summer-long argument that I think I started about 2 + 2 and whether or not it equals 4 or 5. It can attach to anything.
Yeah. When I teach philosophy and worldview, I use the 2 + 2 + 4. And you're a mathematician. Your graduate work is in math, and I think what you define as abstract math at some level.
Enumerative combinatorics, more specifically, if you want to play dorky times.
Well, I really appreciate you saying that, but I must admit, I'm not able to engage that particular branch of mathematics.
We'll sit down and I'll show you the basics sometime. It'll be fun. You'll appreciate it, and we don't have to go very far.
I would appreciate that. But when you say 2 + 2 = 4, the fact is that there are people who, on the one hand, will say 2 + 2 = 4 is obvious, and for instance, when they point to their contract, they want to make it clear that 2 + 2 = 4. But they want to argue that the entire project of Western civilization is based upon an oppressive limitation of knowledge to the privileged, who exercise their privilege by applying 2 + 2 = 4 in such a way that it represses people and groups in particular.
Right.
But you point to something, and I just want to get to this. You know, there can be no resolution, or in other words, the revolution has to continue always. There can be no resolution. This is where it differs from classical Marxism. At least Marx had an eschatology. There is no end game.
Have you read your Paulo Freire, the Brazilian educator, and his remark on
pedagogy of the oppressed? Yeah.
That for a revolution to be authentic, it must be perpetual. For the second it stops being revolutionary, it is the status quo. So, perpetual revolution.
Two big questions I want to address to you. One of them is, and I would have been glad to have had the time to walk through every one of these chapters, because I actually think you trace the genealogy. There's Foucault. Of all of these ideas. It's extremely well. You lay them out very well. But where is this headed? So there's a sense in which I think the American people, and I'll say American Christians, for example, who are deeply aware of the reality of injustice and very concerned about the humanity of every single human being, and know they're supposed to be, they understand that things need to be fixed. Mm-hmm. And I'll call that reform. There's a reform impulse. But what most of them don't understand is that what's going on, and especially, I won't just say the people on the streets, but the people who are driving that dynamic, they're not looking for reformation. They're looking for top-to-bottom revolution. And as we said, just in continuing. So what I see, and I appreciate your title, Cynical Theories. I go back to frustration, heartbreak and frustration. You know, what I see right now happening in the headlines is an enormous amount of heartbreak and frustration. The people, you know, the revolution isn't delivering. So where do you see this going?
I don't think that the ideology itself is stable, and I don't think that it is popular when people see what it is. So I think it will eventually fall. You have to be always wary when you see something like this arising, that it will gain enough institutional power to do some real damage before it collapses. Even the Marxist experiments collapsed, but they did some serious damage along the way. China notwithstanding, we'll see what happens. North Korea, I suppose, also. But I think where this is going is that we're in a moment actually of moral panic. We do have, and of course I share these, profound concerns about the humanity of every individual, every person, regardless of race, sex, gender, sexual identity, as Judith Butler phrased it, that exasperated, et cetera, with all the different categories of people who've had it harder than others historically, and in some ways even today. But we are concerned about drawing that line between reform and revolution. We're very concerned about applying rigorous methodologies to find out what the genuine problems are, the depth of the problems, the causes of the problems, likely solutions to the problems. Whereas on the other side, it's a very toddler-like mentality that there's a bad thing, get it off of me. So not everything with the police is roses. Abolish the police. That's the mentality. The thing that's not working for me, get rid of it completely. Which is a completely different mindset. So where I see this going is using this moral panic, using the narratives that are being spun. We can look at the Black Lives Matter situation. And of course, the three-letter or three-word slogan, not the movement itself, is a truism. It's something that virtually everybody, we can't get everybody, but virtually everybody agrees with in the world today. However, if you look at the movement and you look at the claims that they're making about police violence, they just don't hold up to evidence. If you look at the specific cases that they're holding up as martyrs, they're very flimsy. These are not exactly the martyrs that a movement would want on its side. The stories just don't stack up. So what's happening is that a narrative has run away. There's narrative privilege with this because of the moral panic. So we have institutions taking this stuff on very quickly. I'm hearing more and more from people that it's backfiring where they've taken it on and now they want to find their way out. It's like, well, buddy, you made a deal with the devil. He's going to collect. And that's the end of this, is that it will infiltrate as many institutions as it can, which may go as high as our federal government. It's not impossible. It could happen here, as they say. And every institution that it infects will lose all credibility and collapse within some amount of time that I don't think is terribly long.
Yeah, it can't work. I mean, you see American corporations trying to incorporate, no pun intended, incorporate this, and it doesn't work. So, for instance, there was a New York Times article the other day about inclusivity officers, and their tenure is incredibly short at all these Fortune 500 corporations because they can't deliver, what's expected. They can't bring about a revolution as basically their job description, and it doesn't work. I have a conversation with books all the time. I've got a fountain pen in my hand and a red marker at hand. And so when I read your book, you had one point in your conclusion where you said, we have to avoid this being institutionalized. And I just wrote a giant how in the margins.
Well, we were a little more optimistic when we wrote that chapter, before this riot stuff started. And the answer, what we've seen successfully is consistently being able to stand up and say, to stand for universal principles and individual principles, whether if it's in, say, an institutional setting and somebody says, well, this institution is racist, what has worked, and it does not work easily. I don't want to give people this, it's just a magic wand and it works, but it's to demand evidence. You say the institution's racist, bring the evidence and we'll evaluate it. And let's see the totality of the evidence. Let's weigh it out, and let's have, whether it's a conference or whatever we have to hear the voices. And we do say in the last chapter that we need a humbler liberalism. We need to listen more. Liberals throughout history have, I think that the big takeaway from this whole movement is when you see this frustration and this anger, there's a legitimate side to it as well, which is people don't feel like they're being heard. So we can all learn to listen better. We can all learn to bring people to the table and listen more. But then it has to come down to objective standards. Where's the evidence? We have to have evidence. If we're going to change the organization around your claim of racism, we have to have evidence that the majority of us can agree that a reasonable person, if we use the term from law, a reasonable person standard, would agree that this constitutes a problem. And then let's figure out why that happened, how it happens, and what we can do that might actually work to deliver the answer. When it's in a kind of an individual context, it's a little bit different, where you don't want to necessarily demand evidence. But let's say that, somebody comes to you with this. The principle ultimately is secularism, which protects faith from state encroachment, and it protects the individual from the encroachment of faith. and that they don't necessarily believe. So if a Muslim imam comes to you and they start preaching at you, you can say, listen, brother, I respect your right to believe that, and I'm glad that that's working for you, and I have a different set of commitments that I'm going to uphold. So in this case, somebody could come and say, well, what you just did, don't you think that's a little bit racist? And the reply is, well, I have a different conception of racism, and I feel like I have every right to have a different conception of racism, just like you have the right to have your conception of racism. And we start thinking in terms of this, it's technically secularism. It's the
Right.
in a sense, the beating heart of liberalism is that each person's matters of private conscience get to be their matters of private conscience. If they want to form a community around it, that's a matter of willful inclusion. If you want to form a church, please do. Go practice your faith within, limits of the law, of course. Let's not have sacrifices or whatever else, obviously. But you get to practice your faith as you will, right? And so this seen as a faith, just conceptually, not necessarily legally, immediately starts telling you what to do. How do we keep it from institutionalizing? See it as a faith legally. Then all of a sudden, the entire apparatus of the First Amendment and all of the law around that could start to deinstitutionalize it. Or just watch some start collapsing. You get a couple of big corps collapse, say Disney takes a lot of this on, say they lose, a couple $1 billion, you're immediately going to have a bunch of other corporations firing their diversity officers.
Or at least cosmetically they may leave them in place, but they'll change the way they do business. Yes.
Yeah.
Now, you use the word. This is a footnote, but it gets me to the last big question I want to ask you. I think you misuse the term secularism because you're using it. I see the French use of the word there. In the United States, it generally, at least in my circles, means a more overt hostility to religious faith. And I don't think you mean that.
I don't, no. I mean
in the book.
The broader principle of protecting faith from the state and protecting the individuals from the encroachment of faiths that don't match the contents of their private conscience, which I think everybody agrees with. And
that's part of the American Charter.
Yes.
That's part of the American Charter. I mean, so everyone, meaning everyone outside the United States, that clearly is not the fact, as you would well know,
right.
in much of the world.
And I definitely don't mean by secular anti-religion. I definitely don't mean that.
Yep. All right. So then the final question I want to ask you, and I ask this in all honesty, because I agree with so much of your book. In fact, all the major points of analysis. But you write from a different worldview than my own. I'm an evangelical Christian, and you write as an atheist.
That's right.
And you've written 2 books on that. So one of the things I appreciate most about this book is your affirmation of truth as a category, and your diagnosis of the problem of defining everything as socially constructed and theorizing everything and problematizing everything. So and I mean this with all sincerity. Where do you ground truth? And by this, I understand 2 + 2 = 4. But in a lot of our disputes right now are moral. Where would you point to the true epistemic authority for morality and adjudicating that in a society?
Right. Yeah. Morality is a very complicated question. It is very difficult. So the broad answer to your question, of course, of how do I ground truth? Mm-hmm. If we want to put it in more familiar terms, I might say Spinoza's God, but in general, it is the correspondence theory of truth. That if we go out, you and I, we have very different worldviews, we have very different understandings of things, but if we perform the experiment, then a simple experiment or a complicated experiment, we're going to get roughly the same result. And if that's happening, then we can provisionally use that as a truth. When it comes to morality, we are now in a very complicated sphere. Human beings, psychologically, human beings, sociologically, are very, very complicated systems. And I believe the sciences, sociology, psychology, and so on, that study these things are in their infancy. They're almost, if we look historically at, sciences like geology, they were arguing, like literally with cancel culture, they were arguing over whether the seafloor basalt rock was a product of volcanism or whether it was a product of something precipitating out of the ocean. It was the volcanists versus the Neptunians, which sounds almost like a cartoon now. But there was this very violent conflict between academics before geology became an actual science. And then Lyell very famously said, look, we're just going to go look at the rocks. And they spent 20 years, they formed a conference that were going to set aside their biases and they're going to the best that they can, they're going to look at the rocks and see what the rocks tell them. And then a more mature science of geology was born and has matured ever since. Well, psychology and sociology are extraordinarily immature sciences still. We barely understand what's going on. And we're still caught up in ideas like, is the point of learning about the world to understand it or to change it, to echo Marx. And without having a very robust science of psychology and sociology, we do have to do a lot of approximating. And that's part of why I think that the principle that we just discussed of secularism is so important, is that you are perfectly entitled to your beliefs that morality comes from, say, the Bible, for example, I think is the right answer for you, or your relationship even with Christ, as you understand him through the Bible and through the other theological writings. And I can say that I derive it from my experience with other human beings and what leads to positive outcomes and what leads to negative outcomes. And I admit that's in a very blurry way, and that we can sit down in communication with one another because we believe that there is something that is moral. We believe that there are
Indeed.
Generally right answers to moral questions. And your views can inform mine and my views can inform yours. Maybe it helps you deepen your understanding of theology to talk about, something from neuroscience. And maybe it helps me deepen my understanding of humanity by listening to a theologian and to even read the gospel, for example. And so I think that this is the dividing line, right? That on the one side of this, we have this attitude where we can say that we do believe that there are answers to these questions. We believe that there may be easier or harder to get to, or there are different ways to get to them, and we can use them to mutually inform one another, versus everything is almost relative, which is what we see with this critical social justice ideology. Within postmodernism, of course, it was more or less that everything is relative. And then as it took on the critical theory, the liberationist paradigm came into play, where that which upholds oppression is immoral and that which facilitates liberation, which basically means Marxism, is moral. And that's, of course, one moral view. And if people want to believe it, matter of private conscience, good for you. Let's have a conversation. Maybe you're going to point to things that I'm not seeing, and we can round out a better understanding of human interaction and human flourishing. But I mean, that's a very broad answer to the question. I don't have something to just say, well, God is the objective standard and I can point to that. But I'm also definitely not a subjectivist. Spinoza's God is pointing to the world to try to understand it the best we can.
Fascinating discussion. I would look forward to having further discussions with you as that becomes possible. But you're an intellectually honest man, and I think you've made an incredible case in this new book you've written with Helen Pluckrose, Cynical Theories. So, James Lindsay, thank you for joining me today for Thinking in Public.
Yeah, thank you so much. It's a great conversation, Hal. I appreciate it.
As I said to James Lindsay, I am shocked, frankly, at this point in my life, that the incursions of critical theory and the reified form of postmodernism, and by now you know what we're talking about there, that these have made such headway in American culture, not just in the academy, where, quite honestly, these forms of thought have basically been dominant for the better part of the last several decades, but also in popular culture and in the headlines coming from what's happening on the streets of America. This is a very interesting development. It reminds us of the fact that ideas do have consequences. A title famously made by the conservative writer Richard Weaver. And James Lindsay affirmed that very statement today. Ideas have consequences. They always do. But ideas also have a history. And ideas have future consequences that it's our responsibility to try to trace out. And another thing about ideas is that they are themselves always developing. That's always true. You have one book on one idea. The next thing you know, there are 10 books, and then it's 150 books. But the conversation changes with every one of those books in some way or another. As time goes forward, it's very interesting that just talking about traditional Western liberalism, James made the very good point that it's not one thing in the sense that it's continuing to develop as a way of adjudicating conflict and dealing with ideas. As Christians, we look at this with a particular concern because it's not only about understanding the consequences of ideas and the intellectual context of our day. It's understanding how we see all of these things as measured against the totality of a Christian worldview. One of the things that comes up to me again and again in this book is the fact that there's the frustration of the eschatology that never comes. But if you are operating from a secular worldview, that eschatology is going to have to come now or you're never going to see it. But of course, the true communism never emerged. Utopia never comes. And that's where Christians have a very different worldview, a very different timeline. We are looking forward to the kingdom of Christ in its fullness. But that also means that we don't expect all issues to be adjudicated and every eye to be dry and every tear to be wiped away until then. We do believe we're here to do good and to glorify God and to make a difference and to engage our culture in such a way. But we have to engage our culture with truth, and that gets back to the last part of the conversation with James. Our understanding of truth is not just based on the correspondence theory of truth. That's the first test of truth, by the way, for Christians. But it's that when we talk about morality and when we talk about issues of our ultimate theological concern, we actually believe that they correspond to objective reality, the objective reality of the self-existent God. And yes, this takes us down to the authority of Scripture. So Christians are going to read this book and should read it very sympathetically and very appreciatively as an incredible indictment of what's happening in intellectual culture on both sides of the Atlantic. And it needs to inform how we think, how we observe. It needs to inform our church life. It needs to inform our engagement with the political and moral and cultural issues of the day. It needs to inform how we think about the academy and sending our kids to college. It needs to alert us to how we talk and how we hear other people talk. But we will also realize that this particular book is written from a defender of not only Western liberalism in the more historic sense, but also of issues that are more contemporary than anything the founders of historic modern classical liberalism would have imagined. LGBTQ issues, for example. And so Christians are going to have a very interesting conversation with this book, but it's really important. I meant what I said. I think it's the best analysis of the contemporary intellectual scene, written by someone who, or by two authors in this case, who really do understand what critical theory is. They understand what it means that postmodernism never went away and is continuing, what it means that this is translated into the most not only seemingly unbelievable, but dangerous forms of thought, and why it matters, because we care, because of love of God and love of neighbor. We care about what thought systems are shaping the thoughts and minds of our neighbors and what thoughts are establishing the society that we share with our neighbors. We understand all of this matters. And again, I'm very thankful for this conversation with James Lindsay. Hope for more conversations in the future. If you enjoyed this conversation, you'll find more than 100 of these programs at albertmohler.com under the tab Thinking in Public. I want to thank you today for joining me for Thinking in Public. And until next time, keep thinking.